All right, thank you, everyone. I am very honored to be here at this conference. This is incredible. It's the first time I've been here. So I was going to start off with introductions, which I actually will do. The theme of our panel is getting older gracefully, okay? But first, let's focus on getting older, right? So we all get old, right? We're human beings, right? We're human machines, right? We've talked a lot today about transparency, right? I think 90% to 80% of our panels are on transparency. Perhaps I'm going to use humility here when I talk about me as a human machine. As I'm getting older, I notice that it takes me 10 minutes to get out of bed, right? So as a result, I wear ankle braces every day. I wear a CPAP machine because I snore, right? Because my wife can't sleep. I don't have hair like I had 20 years ago, and I truthfully can't do anything about that. That's just from being at AMSTAT for 20 years. So with that in mind, I know that he gave us introductions, but I still think these gentlemen who are very well respected in industry would perhaps like to introduce themselves as well. So Bob, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Bob Wilke. I'm the Managing Director for AvRisk. And I think you wanted us to say kind of what demographic
what you do,
yeah,
what you do. Maybe if you think, if you want to jump into humility or transparency.
Humility,
yeah.
I represent the end-of-life demographic.
So we're being transparent.
I'm Tony Kioussis. I'm President and CEO of Asset Insight. I think, according to Alistair, I represent bearded life or something like that. Just glad to be here, and great venue, great stuff. Hope this panel continues to add to it.
I'm Daniel Hall, Certified Appraiser with Flight Ascend Consultancy based in New York. I don't know, I've never used a fax machine. So.
Very good. Yeah, you don't qualify. Brendan?
Sorry, why are we here? I've forgotten. I'm Brendan Lodge from GSSI. I joined there about 3 months ago, and part of my role there is to acquire end-of-life aircraft for parting out as part of the GSSI parts business. I'm going to be getting more and more active and talking to quite a few in the room, hopefully, at some point in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so that was kind of our transition into getting older, and now we're going to talk about getting older gracefully. Obviously, like I said, we're human machines. Now we're going to talk about man-made machines. Those are some of the topics we're going to try very hard to cover. We're slightly time constrained here. So what I wanted to do, since I was so humble, I'm going to do a little slight plug for AMSTAT and show you really the age of the fleet over the last 10 years, right? So I put it in 3 buckets essentially, from 0 to 10 years, from 11 to 21, and from anything over 21 years. And I think you can see, you know, it's interesting actually when you look at the older aircraft, right? The 40.4% is exactly the same over the last 5 years. Where you see the big change over the last 5 years is of course in the lower level, which is the newer aircraft, because there's been slightly less production. So you see really the growth in the middle part of the market. So this represents the actual age of our aircraft, which is what everybody's concerned about, right? So that's, you know, that's more black and white. How old is something? It's black and white. You can't argue how old something is. Bob, when we had a discussion, you talked a little bit more about kind of more of the gray areas of what ages something, and I think you wanted to expand about that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think your analogy to a human being and a mechanical device is very appropriate in this situation. I kind of look at, you know, if I look at my experience in life and maybe some of the automobiles I've owned, what factors come into play? Obviously, the actual age of the aircraft, but when it comes to airplanes, they want to fly. I had about a 30-year career in lending, and the philosophy was the fewer hours in landings and cycles on that airplane, the more valuable it's going to be. So if an airplane didn't fly for a year, the thought was, ooh, that's a good thing. Well, guess what? It's not. Because when airplanes sit, This is for the lenders in the group. Bad things happen. Corrosion begins within the structure and between within the wing panels. You see actuators that are not being operated. Hydraulic systems go bad, seals go bad. And actually, if you have an aircraft that sits for about 3 months, you should start to initiate either operating it in some fashion, and the preference is to fly it, or to begin to move towards long-term preservation of that asset. Other values is the pedigree of the ownership. If you have an aircraft that is owned by a celebrity or a large company, and they've held it for virtually all of its life until it goes into the pre-owned marketplace, that is a very valuable trait. If you've had an aircraft transition from multiple users and operators, especially internationally, where the maintenance has been performed in different facilities, that tends to diminish the value. People, if they're trading their airplanes frequently, they're not necessarily keeping them as clean and up to date as they should. Operations, base location is extremely important. We represented a bank that owned a Bombardier Global 5000 that was located in the Middle East that sat on the tarmac outside for 1.5 years. Bad things happened, especially to the paint and the interior. So you want to know where your aircraft is being held and operated, and know their frequent destinations as well. If you have, in this instance, where we have a Middle East operated aircraft, you generally are going to ingest fine particulate matter into the engines, and then you go fly out over salt water and through salt air. That obviously has a very negative impact on the aircraft. One of the most vital things in preserving value is accurate and complete maintenance records. The aircraft is the maintenance logbooks. If you lose them, you are in major, major difficulty. And who is performing that maintenance? Is it a guy that drives up with his tools in a pickup truck, or is it one of the premier MRO facilities? That makes a huge difference. When I'm appraising an aircraft, I put a lot of emphasis on who's been performing the maintenance. Damage history is one that really has come into play. In the States, if you have a component that's replaced, and Bombardier is very good at pulling something out, pushing something in. There's no FAA Form 337 involved. If in your older Gulfstream aircraft you have a damaged situation, it actually greatly impairs the value. The ability to upgrade an aircraft and keep it modern and current is another tremendous value add. To go in and, as Nextant Aviation does in Cleveland, offer now a Challenger 604 upgrade where you can get 3 glass panels and ADSB compliance, as well as Fans 1A for $600,000. That's a huge deal.
So Bob, let me ask you, do you think that, based on everything that you've outlined, right, would you say the operators are aware of the serious implications of everything you've outlined and how potentially that could affect the resale value of that aircraft, or anybody else from the panel for that matter? Do you think, Tony, Daniel, Brendan, do you think operators are aware of the implications that has on the retail value, everything that Bob just outlined for us?
I think they're aware of it. In many instances, they don't care, especially some of the smaller charter operators. And we had a situation where the charter operation had 5 aircraft, and it was a leased Premier 1A. And they just basically destroyed it, and they tied the aircraft up in litigation, so it couldn't go back to the lender for an extended period of time. And the value dropped during that period of time from $2.3 million to 1.45.
Oh, wow. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Or?
I think there are a lot of people that don't realize how badly an aircraft can be impacted or its value can be impacted if it's parked. A lot of people, a lot of bankers that I speak to, especially some small bank that financed an aircraft for a friend of a friend, like always a disaster, they don't realize that if an airplane's parked, even though it's on an hourly cost maintenance program, or even if it's under warranty, if the engines aren't stored, the program will become void at some point. And they really don't have a clue. I mean, we've been through this with a number of operators, and we run appraisals on aircraft, and they're amazed at how badly the aircraft's been dinged. And it's been dinged because, it's been sitting out in Sao Paulo for 9 months, not flown, not stored, not anything. That airplane is ready for the scrap heap. It doesn't matter how old it is. It could be very, very new. In one particular case it was. Doesn't matter. The airplane's toast.
All right, Alistair just reduced our time a little bit here, so we've got to really move this along, right? Or else we get an umbrella. Yeah, we're good? Yeah, okay. So let's move on to the next topic. Will everyone meet the U.S. ADSB deadline? Bob touched on it before. I put together some very, very quick numbers. A lot of this is based on AMSTAT data and some third-party resources, which shows the compliant fleet, both in the jets and the turboprop market versus non-compliant. This is based on AMSTAT research as well as some independent resources that we're working with currently. As you can see, it kind of coincides with what I believe was reported at the Miami convention, whereas about the same numbers, maybe about 40% that potentially won't be compliant in 2020. So I guess I'll ask the questions of you guys, really, since, popcorn style, like how close will we get to come January 1st, 2020, as far as, percentage of fleet that won't be able to fly? Popcorn, anybody, anyone.
Oh, okay. Percentage
Anybody
of
that
fleet,
has any feeling.
I can't guess, but I can tell you there are not enough physical shop slots to get these aircraft compliant with this standard. And a lot of folks over in Europe say, oh, that's okay. I just, I'm on FANS 1A and I'm good to go there. Well, what happens when you get to the States and you get there to celebrate New Year's Eve on 2019, and you wake up on 2020 and you find out that your aircraft cannot operate in the States except under very rigid circumstances? It's a rude awakening, and it's something that every international operator should be very well aware of and be procuring their slots now.
So what are the implications, I guess, both positive and negative, of this potentially large percentage of the fleet being grounded? Anyone that wants to maybe chime in? Again, popcorn style, just anybody with any thoughts on positives first, maybe, or negatives?
Well, if your aircraft is not equipped with ADSB come January 2020, you're effectively grounded. And the airplane will take a substantive hit in valuation. If you have the equipment on board today, you might get a slight increase in the value of the aircraft, but as we get closer and closer to 2020, that value is dissipating because you have to have it on the airplane in order for the airplane to be useful and valid. So that's kind of the way it's flowing from a valuation perspective. Daniel, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll discuss it a bit later, the appraisal side.
What I was going to say is that, we've been writing engine programs, particularly now for decades, and we've got quite a lot of aging aircraft, many that are coming up sort of 24, 25 years old. It's proving to be quite a trigger among, especially, ADSB out, when it's coinciding with a need for a large inspection, maybe landing gear overhaul. It is it's proving to be quite a trigger for people to actually sit there and think, do we want to spend the money? And what my role is now encompassing is, we are entering into dialogue with people who've got maybe engine overhauls coming up, where despite spending the money on a major airframe inspection and landing gear and ADSB and overhauling the engines, the aircraft is still going to be worth a lot less than the money that's going to be spent on it. And we're entering into dialogue with some of the owners now to make them offers to buy out of the program and buy the aeroplane for parting out. And I think you're going to see quite a lot of these aircraft are not going to be sort of going through the ADSB. They will be, ending their life and helping to maintain some of the more serviceable aircraft in the fleet.
So now I'm going to ask everyone a question. We'll go down the line here, really yes or no. Given that potentially a percentage of anywhere from maybe 30 to 40% of the fleet may not be flying come January 1st, 2012. Do you see any chance, and I'll ask the audience as well, we'll put a poll up there, any chance that the FAA would extend the deadline for ADSB in the U.S. on January 1st, 2020?
Absolutely not. It will not extend. And the reason is, in the States, the ADSB system infrastructure is going live and is actually operating right now. A lot of people don't realize that.
Okay. Tony?
No, they won't extend. They've already gone in writing 3 times saying that they're not going to be extending. So in fact, I spoke to an FAA official 2 weeks ago, and they said there's no chance of an extension coming.
No, we don't believe they'll extend. The reality is there's going to be thousands of aircraft which will be grounded on Jan 1st, 2020, but I do believe that perhaps some more MRO entities could come in and help with the upgrades. They'd have to announce that this year. And I also believe that the OEMs are not going to let their newest models go out of check. So I think perhaps we could see more OEM involvement in making aircraft compliant.
Any thoughts, Brendan?
Based over this side of the pond, I have to say I've not really formed an opinion on it. I'm not that close to the situation in the States, but I think it's a common problem in Europe as well. And the MRO slot situation is a very valid comment.
Okay. So we'll stick to that. So 87% is saying no, that the FAA will stick to it. So I think for the most part we're in agreement there. All right, so let's move on. So the next question is, how old is too old, and then how long will 2018 deliveries fly for? So Tony, I want to kind of focus this more on you. This is you considering your analysis of the fleet using maintenance exposure and asking price risk. Can you give us your insight on that as far as what your opinion is there?
The modern aircraft are being designed to fly for 50 years plus, and from where we sit, the aircraft really runs out of value from an economic perspective more than it will from a technical perspective. Can you back up to the other slide, please?
Okay, sorry.
One of the analytics that we run on a monthly basis is we calculate the maintenance exposure to price ratio for the average of each model aircraft, and we break it down into large, medium, small, turboprops, et cetera. The ETP ratio, as it's called, and you probably heard Boeing Business Jets was using it relative to the valuation of the BBJ yesterday. The ETP ratio is a really interesting indicator. It's computed by dividing the maintenance exposure of the aircraft, the embedded maintenance on the aircraft, by the ask price. The curious thing that happens is as the price drops on the aircraft, it gets within 40% of the maintenance exposure of the aircraft. Once that happens, the buyer makes an offer that addresses the cost that's embedded in the maintenance of the aircraft, and the seller finds the offer to be too low to sell the airplane, so they never reach a deal. And you might think that that's something that doesn't play that big a role, but you'll find that when the ETP ratio crosses 40%, your days on the market for the aircraft that aircraft make model, that specific serial number, in fact, increase exponentially. The interesting thing that is, at the end of the year, 54% of the models and nearly 2/3 of the fleet that we track, and we track, from a maintenance perspective, we track something like 92 models. 62% of the aircraft were at 40% or above. That red line that you see there is the average ETP ratio across the spectrum, and it's been above 40% since March of 2014, which gives you an idea of how old some of these airplanes are. Next slide. This will just give you an idea of how this the spread occurs, and it's real. The difference between an aircraft below 40% ETP ratio and above 40% ETP ratio is an increase of 42% in the days on the market. Airplanes in the end of December that had an ETP ratio below 40% were averaging 199 days, whereas aircraft at 40% or above were averaging 284 days. And these aren't, a lot of them are older airplanes, but if you go to the next slide, you'll see that a lot of these airplanes are really not that far off the beaten path, and you can see some of these ETP ratios. Now, we stopped at, where did we stop this month? I believe it's at 55. I mean, I can tell you that there's airplanes that have an ETP ratio of 1,000. Those things are coffee pots flying disguised as an airplane. They're, it's not that you won't be able to sell, but you're going to have to find someone that wants a disposable aircraft. You need a disposable aircraft buyer, essentially.
All right. Thank you, Tony. All right, so the next question was, will anyone finance them? We are going to choose to skip that question, considering our time restraint, and we have a whole finance panel that's coming up next, so we'll let them dive into that if they'd like to. We'll let Daniel expand a little bit more on the financing side, but more on the valuation side of it as far as how he feels, if it will be financed, but more, the risk involved in financing those type of aircraft.
Yeah, so as quickly as I can, running out of time, but yeah, from the appraisal side, at Flight Ascent Consultancy, we started thinking about this a couple of years ago, the whole ADSB impacts, and what we found actually more and more financiers are now speaking to us and trying to actually understand the potential problems that are coming up. And I think that's one of the most important parts, because I still think there's a few parties who are just not aware of it, and it's sneaking up. So I think, together, the appraisal community, the financiers, the brokers, everyone needs to be talking to each other and just checking that, the aircraft are compliant. So we started thinking about it from appraisers. Last year, we introduced value modifiers to all of our business jet types for compliance with ADSB mandates. And we just put together this, really summary slide. And I guess the first thing I should say is that when we talk about, very light jets and light jets, that is the bulk of the market. So we're talking some 70 to 80% of the fleet is that size category of aircraft. Generally lowest cost to comply. But actually, we think one of the highest risk areas is some of the light mediums and the medium aircraft. This is older Citation models. Early Challengers, early Falcons. They have sometimes very expensive costs to comply with the mandates compared to the value of the asset. So far, we have seen some people spend 25% of the asset value on compliance. That's the highest we've seen so far. But it's going to be a very serious conversation if they go ahead and do that. There could be groundings across all asset classes. But if the asset is worth more money, you're going to put the expenditure into it to keep it current come 2020. And in terms of the effects on values, similar to what Brendan was saying, today we do see slight premiums really on types which have met the mandate requirements right now. The premium is usually at cost or slightly below today, but as we move closer to the deadline, we're going to see that changing. We're going to start to see potentially negative modifiers for some types next year, which have not had it done, particularly if it's clear that there's no time for them to go ahead and have those upgrades done. So we're obviously keeping a very close eye on this, and I think it's very important that the community is aware, and we're talking about it. So this is really important today.
Thank you, Daniel. How long can OEMs support legacy aircraft for? So when we talked about this as a group, you know, Brendan, you had some thoughts on this that maybe you wanted to expand on a little bit. You know, specifically, obviously, with legacy aircraft, you were intimately involved with and currently. So, you know, give us your thoughts on that.
I think the OEM support in most cases is still there for some pretty old aircraft out there, and you know, some of the citations flying around now, you know, go back, you know, decades, and they're still flying around, they're still being supported. I think maybe the Hawker story is going to be a bit different. Maybe I am hearing occasionally from the marketplace that, you know, obtaining spares now is getting more and more difficult for those who are still trying to keep them running, particularly the older Hawkers. But, you know, what I wanted to do was just run through, you know, without giving too much information away, because I'm sure the room full of people like this, someone might recognize the scenario. But we've got several scenarios on the go at the moment. And I want to just run through one particularly, and it's an aircraft built in the early 90s. And we're on the hook on an engine program, and we're happy to, you know, undergo our obligations to overhaul the engines in about 600 hours' time. In order to fly those 600 hours, this aeroplane has got to go through a major, it's a C check, but it's a 24-year C check, and it's got its landing gear overhaul due at the same time, and it's got to do the compliance for ADSB. So we estimate the cost of that is about $1 million to put it through all of that. So the owner's got to spend $1 million to fly it the 700 hours it's got to do for us to then overhaul the engines. And it's just looking like it's not worth it, because when we've all spent all of that money, it's still only going to be worth about $1.6 million. So, and we've got quite a few scenarios like that we're looking at currently, and entering into sort of very meaningful dialogue with the owners. But these are the kind of triggers that are, you know, it's the economic argument, the physical depreciation of the asset, the economic depreciation of the asset, all coming into play and making some fairly complex situations for us to, you know, discuss with the owners. And, you know, that was what I wanted to run through. So,
Excellent. Thank you, Brendan. All right, so we're really not going to hit on the last question that we wanted to touch on because we have less than a minute left. So with the aircraft lifetimes being pushed out further, do we need to rethink ownership? So I think that's a question for all of us to ponder. Do you have any questions any questions from the audience first?
Yeah, you've got a couple you've got one on Slido. Have you got a question?
Okay. We'll take the first one then. Which platforms are oldest and last longer? Turboprops, lighter jets, medium jets, or heavy jets?
Yes.
That's exactly what they wanted to hear.
It's all over the place.
With the complexities of monitoring and preserving asset security that increase with the aircraft age, what benefit is there for financiers to invest in that space? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
and I guess, you know, as an ex-financier and having sat through many of the panels at these kind of events, the issue you face with the older aircraft is not so much one of the fact they're old, because there are still some financiers who will look at older aircraft, but it seems to be the value of the aircraft, and therefore the value of the lending, which seems to be the main driver. And this is, I'm sure, going to get covered in the finance panel that's coming up, but there's a threshold where it's just not worth the time and effort to put in to financing an older airplane because of its value more than the fact it's old.
Good. Do you have any more for us, Alistair? Or are we? Okay, we have one last one. Looking on the bright side, when the values get to zero, at least it stops depreciating. Not a question, but a perfect way to stop the panel. So, Thank you all very much.